Hi, I'm Janice Switlo, and I just want to put out today a brief episode that contains some warnings. There's a lot of focus on Canada for critical minerals mining and other resource extraction, and a lot of emphasis and marketing of how we're such a great source for that. So there's increasing pressures through provincial mining exploration and developments through various legislation that's being passed that have got people concerned and upset. And there's a frustration that even being expressed by lawyers, for example, who may think they know what they're doing, but I would suggest that their frustration is because of their own actions. And so I'm going to do a number of episodes covering off mining and covering off what we're dealing with over the next few days. But today I want to emphasize this. I warned before that when direct action activities were happening, that the various people who are speaking are media is looking for anyone to say something, and anyone is saying something. Consistently, what I was noticing and warning about is that everyone is using what I call the Section 35 domestic doctrine language. They're saying things like Aboriginal right, Indigenous right, Indigenous title, Aboriginal title. You didn't consult us. That's one of the big ones. All of these are triggers that say you're relying upon the Section 35 doctrine, which is a court-made doctrine. It's not in a treaty. It doesn't come from a treaty. It wasn't agreed to. This was put in place by one side of the scenario, and that is the governments that Her Majesty and now His Majesty, the delegations of self-governance that resulted in more and more direct exercise of authorities by the governments of the Dominion of Canada. I warned that using that language and saying you're relying on that doctrine was going to have severe consequences and ultimately undermines completely the intended effort. And we're seeing that that is indeed what has happened when we look to the permanent injunction, for instance, that has been put in place against people at 1492 Land Back. When we look at the recent, raid and activities over at Gedimpton checkpoint, that is there supporting hereditary chiefs with Sutinton. But remember, their language was all relying on, the Delgamuukw case. Well, that's a Section 35 doctrine development case. That is not reliance on Indigenous law, your own laws. And so we have in both courts in BC and courts in Ontario now saying that, well, even if they believe that's what they're doing, they have no standing. In other words, they cannot pursue Section 35 doctrine. And who can? Basically chiefs and council. And so what are you achieving? Because you're saying, we love this Section 35 doctrine, and you didn't consult us. But you don't have any ability to go into court under that very same doctrine to pursue that. Why? Because you're a hereditary chief's helper, or because you're individuals that are set up on some property and saying, hey, we're not leaving because you didn't consult us. Well, under the doctrine, they don't have to. And you simply handed the ability to the courts to say, we have a lawful way to remove you. That defeats the whole purpose. And furthermore, it's important to understand just how well prepared Canada is to cut these things down quickly. And that's why, because we've got the critical minerals, the mining, all these sorts of things. Canada's ready for you in terms of expecting the same old approach. particularly where you use the Section 35 doctrinal language, as opposed to acting and speaking as nationals of nations. And hereditary chiefs, for example, speaking in accordance with their laws, as opposed to saying, I love, and that's basically what it comes across as, I love this Section 35 doctrine. Canada knows the doctrine, planned for the doctrine, put it in place, knows perfectly well how to use it, and laughs all the way to the courthouse every time one of these things happens. But what's going to happen before we get to that point? Well, we have the Anti-Terrorism Act that can apply, including to anybody who counsels direct activity that could be termed under that act. Remember, this is controlled by courts, to have been behavior that's considered unlawful under that act. You have special policing bodies, if you will, that have been established. There's a new one in BC, for example, that's set up to specifically deal with, what's it called, Community Industry Response Group. You have this preparedness that's happening, a huge expansion on the national entity that does this type of work. And they have, you hand them the lawful ability to apply these. You also have critical infrastructure legislation I warned about too. Again, laws being put in place, allowing, and that the entities being prepped in order to be able to handle these things that weren't in place, for instance, when Gustafson Lake a standoff was happening, or when Oka was happening. But it prompted, those incidences prompted the development of these agencies in order to do what they do. And their, one motto is action, not words. So this is not designed to be reconciliatory and an action of reconciliation. They are established specifically to go in and make it clear for development, industry, mining, what have you. So I really caution people, because I'm getting people contacting me and saying, we're going to go do this. And it's like, well, you're just doing the same thing that didn't work last time. What, you got different people? You got a different attitude? You're not going to have any different of an outcome. You're just going to set up people to end up with criminal records and potential loss of life, because some of these agencies are being trained in certain ways. And remember, back at Gustafson Lake, they gave the green light to shoot to kill, right? So this isn't new. Gustafson Lake, that's back, almost 30 years now. So even more so now when we're talking trillions of dollars, with global demand, with the United States saying, hey, we're going to give money to developers in Canada so we can get our hands on these critical minerals because we need them. We want to make batteries in the States, things like that. So the natural resources that are still owned by Indigenous nations are under a renewed, it's like the new gold rush, right? Under a renewed attention. And Canada is ready and going to not allow its citizens to prevent that from happening. When you use the Section 35 doctrine, you're saying you're only Canadian. You're saying you're, yes, a domestic ethnic minority. You are allowing Canada to control. And remember that Section 35 doctrine specifically says and holds that when there is a meaningful economic objective, you can be completely pushed aside and it's lawful. When there is a national objective or interest at stake, you can be completely pushed aside. Those are not rights. Rights are something that are permanent, that cannot be removed or lessened. Sovereignty as a nation's having treaties, totally different situation. I will talk more in next episodes about how some organizations are trying to use treaty, but they're failing badly and making it even worse. And I'll provide specifics on that, because it's my hope and intention to have people be calm, have them rely on the power of what is left for you by your ancestors. You're nationals of your nations. You're not just Canadian citizens. Remember, your citizenship was just deemed. You didn't have to apply for it. You didn't ask for it. Canada just said, okay, you're part of us, back in 1960. So it's important to not just say, we got to go off and do something. Hold on a minute. You're going to probably need some important advice to say, do you know what you're doing? What are the risks? How do you approach this? Because quite frankly, it's all being done in a way that ends up causing more harm, gives more power to Canada, and sets up the people for feeling hopeless and defeated. And that's the worst thing we need for young generations especially. They need to begin to understand better what their ancestors left them, and what they're supposed to be leaving their future generations. Nations, sovereignty, treaties. Permissions are personal to the king. They're not assignable to third-party companies. So regardless of what a province or Canada says to mining companies, for example, that you need to satisfy, you're not just part of that. You're not just underneath that. You're the owners. You're in the position to provide the permissions directly if you want and under what terms. And that's all I have to say.